Potassium. We don't consider it an environmental pollutant, but it's really prone to leaching and loss. So it can become extremely expensive to manage on your farms, especially soils that are lighter texture and that have low cation exchange capacity, because those systems readily lose potassium, and so it just becomes costly. And also, potassium actually is influenced by other nutrients in the soil, and the high potassium levels can cause metabolic disorders in your animals and lead to other metabolic disorders like grass tetany. So I think it's an important nutrient to talk about. So this is the potassium cycle. Pretty straightforward, really. There's this soil solution potassium similar to the phosphorus soil solution. So this is kind of water with potassium in it, and that's the potassium that the plant roots can easily take up. Then you have the mineral potassium that very slowly, that dotted line means very slowly, over time, breaks down the rocks, they erode, the potassium becomes released. And then you have sort of what we call exchangeable potassium. This is the potassium that's stuck on the exchange sites on your soil. And it's stuck on loosely, like I said, so it sort of moves into soil solution and back on to the exchange sites pretty readily. We also have this thing we call fixed potassium, which is potassium that kind of gets wedged in between the layers of clay. And it kind of gets stuck in there, and it's held on. We say it becomes fixed, and it doesn't become available as rapidly as just the potassium that kind of hangs off the side. So you can picture this as being kind of wedged in between those clay layers I talked about versus exchangeable potassium that just sort of hangs off the side. Okay, so it's not a very complex nutrient cycle. There is some biology involved with this, especially when you're talking about some of the animal manure and plant residues and the release of the potassium from organic matter. There is some biology involved there, but for the most part, a lot of the potassium in our manure is kind of readily available. It doesn't take a lot of biology to break it down. All right, so again, I just sort of talked about this. You have potassium, in rocks, and it mineralizes over time. So most of the potassium in your soil is what we would consider unavailable. And then you have this fixed potassium, or slowly available, that's kind of stuck in between the clay layers. And then you have the exchangeable potassium. You can see it's kind of just hanging off of the side. And that moves quickly into and out of soil solution, which is what is really available to your plants. What's measured in your soil test is this piece right here. So and it's the same thing we talked about with phosphorus. What shows up on your soil test isn't actually the total potassium in your soil. It's what we believe will become available into the soil solution for your plants. I see a lot of potassium deficiencies on farms. They're very easy to see, but I think commonly, especially in corn, they get attributed to something else. A lot of it gets attributed to nitrogen sometimes. But basically, because potassium is really mobile in the plant, so it moves very quickly from the top to the bottom, where we see potassium deficiency is in the lower leaves of corn and other crops too. And basically, we see signs of the deficiency right at the tips. You sort of see this burning back of the tips. It's very common. I see it a lot. And so if you have potassium deficient soils, certainly you likely will see this. You can sort of ignore nutrient deficiencies if you want, but I think you have to understand that if you're deficient in one nutrient, it highly impacts the other nutrients as well, and your plant. Your plant needs all of these to grow. It's not really up to you to decide which ones they should have. You can if you want, but ultimately they need all 16 nutrients. And if they're short in one, you are limiting their productivity, which could be yield, could be quality, resistance to diseases, whatever it is. So, you really need to give the plants what they're asking for if you want to maximize productivity. Okay? Here's an example of potassium deficiency in alfalfa, which we do see quite a lot. I think most people know or have heard that alfalfa requires a lot of potassium, like almost 300 pounds of potassium a year, which is a lot. But we still, see potassium deficiencies, and again, it's sort of a speckling white at the tips of the leaves there. Most any legume requires a lot of potassium, so we will see deficiencies in those. And then here's deficiency in a soybean crop. So again, potassium deficiency, especially on light textured soils, I see it quite often, but I think most people sort of write it off as a nitrogen deficiency, and that's what they're sort of look towards, is adding nitrogen, and that's not the problem. I've seen this a lot over the last, few years where we've had extreme shortages on feed, where people are trying, if you can get that fourth cut or fifth cut even, you're taking it because you need the feed. But what happens, especially as you move later and later and later into the season, is that if you harvest a crop on that borderline of the end of the season, right, and you cut it really low especially, in order for that plant to regrow, to start its regrowth, it needs sunlight for one thing, because the little itty-bitty bit of green that's left there will start to photosynthesize and regrow. But where that regrowth actually comes from is here, is in the root. So if you mow in, let's say, October, I've seen a lot of this the last few years, beginning of October, and then we get some nice weather and that plant starts to regrow, it takes everything out of its roots to do that until there's enough biomass to actually start to photosynthesize. Then it has to grow so much before it starts to replenish the root system. And once the root system is replenished, that's when you should really be thinking about kind of mowing again, right? Because now the plant has kind of reinvigorated itself, and then when you remow it, it can kind of start the cycle over again. So if you don't kind of allow the plant to do that, to recover, even with pasture management, that's where you start to see your stands die out, and then you also get winter injury, because if you go into the winter with this really weak, sort of empty root system, it usually doesn't survive. And in the last few years, we've seen a ton of winter kill on alfalfa stands and even grass stands because of that sort of management. And so the plant will start to regrow, use everything in its root, predisposes it to winter injury, and then we see massive die-outs of forage in the spring. And that's why that happens. So, you really have to think about that. And if you need it, if you absolutely need it, take it. If not, leave it, okay? Because the plant needs to recover and rebuild itself, okay? And that's why even, in pastures, we see the same things when you're constantly kind of going back too early. And that's how I see actually reed canary die out the best. If you want to kill reed canary, mow it a lot, mow it more and more, because it cannot withstand that 30-day mowing. It actually will die out from that, especially if you're doing it 4 or 5 times a year. So potassium in grass management, so your legumes, especially alfalfa, love potassium. They need a lot of it to survive. But grasses also need potassium, and they're really good at scavenging potassium in the soil because they have those huge fibrous root systems. So they're really competitive for potassium. So the point here is if you have a mixed stand of alfalfa and grass and you're trying to maintain that stand and you're not giving it enough potassium, the grass will always outcompete the alfalfa for the potassium. So the alfalfa will never have enough if you're not giving the crop exactly what it needs. And then eventually you end up with all grass. Now, one thing I like about potassium is it's a really good nutrient to describe how we approach nutrient recommendations for your crops. Potassium is a good example of why we use these different approaches. So there's 3 kind of approaches that are commonly used in making recommendations of nutrients for field crops, and potassium in this particular example. So the first approach is the sufficiency approach, and commonly the university is criticized for using only this approach to managing nutrients in the soil and in your crops. And so this approach looks at maintaining a level of nutrients in your actual soils. If you maintain your nutrients at optimum based on your soil test, then that's also the level at which yield would be optimized in quality. Okay? If you're below that optimum level, then it is likely if you added some of this nutrient, you would see a yield response. If it's above optimum, then there's no benefit to your crop to adding more. So that's the sufficiency approach. And it is pretty much, for most universities, that's the approach that they use. Okay? They're only looking at the soil tests. The second approach, which is the approach where you look at what the crop is removed. So you looked at your mass nutrient balances, and it calculates the total amount of nutrients your crop is going to take out of the soil. That approach does not at all account for what's in the soil. It only says this is what the crop will remove. Okay? And if you just looked at that, and that's what we call the maintenance approach, the replacement approach, it would be very expensive for you to maintain your crops because you are not at all accounting for anything based on what the soil is going to make available. And then there's this third approach that I would say is very common through some testing labs and some soil experts, which is this cation balance approach. This is an approach that they use quite often, sort of balance of cations in your soil. So these are the nutrients that are on your soil. That's what makes up the cation exchange capacity. And we show these on your soil test, this balance. How many of the binding sites have calcium on them? How many of the binding sites have magnesium? How many have potassium? That's shown on your soil test. And some folks use this approach where what they do is they just focus on balancing these minerals in your soil and getting that optimum balance, which is 2 to 5% potassium, 70 to 80% calcium, and 10 to 12% magnesium. And I think you can see how that approach could get you in a lot of trouble because, first of all, it doesn't really think about anything else. No other nutrients are involved in using that approach, really. It also can be very dangerous, especially if you have a soil that just based on the type of soil that it is, it's just high in magnesium. And no matter what you do, you're never going to be able to get those levels to really go down. Okay, so trying to just focus on this, or even this, can kind of get you in trouble, one point or the other. And so what UVM actually does, and other universities as well, is that they use a combination of all three of these to make a recommendation, which is likely the best approach. Don't worry about your balances too much. It's good to look at it, but UVM actually takes those into consideration when they make a recommendation for you. So if your magnesium, the percent magnesium on your base saturation is really low compared to the amount of potassium, they'll make a recommendation for magnesium. So they do look at those balances. We also look at yields and how much the crop will remove. And when you are making potassium recommendations, you actually do put in your projected yield because it does make a difference on how much is in the soil, how much your crop is going to remove, and what balance of nutrients you have and what you should end up adding to the soil to grow the crops. So again, the sufficiency level approach that the university uses is that once you hit this optimum range in your soil test, this is where you see maximum yields right here, and if you apply more fertilizer after that, you're not going to see any yield increase. Okay, and then if you are below the optimum, increase if you add a fertilizer until you hit the optimum. So that's the sufficiency approach. The maintenance approach, again, is based on crop removal rates. And this is really dangerous approach to use with potassium, okay? And this is why. This is the amount of potassium that's required for optimum growth and yields. And once you get past this point, you would think that the plant would know when to shut it off. Like, oh, I don't need any more potassium, I have enough. But the issue with potassium is that it is a nutrient that is luxury consumed by your crops. So if there is a lot of it there, they will continue to take it up until you probably harvest them. And that's why we see, we commonly see these issues with really high potash speeds because they're taking up far more than what they actually need to grow. So, this is sort of works on both ends. If you don't have enough potassium, you're sort of hurting your plants by not being able to reach that maximum yield and quality. And if you have too much potassium, they just keep taking it up, causing issues with your animals a lot of the times. Okay? And too much potassium also causes other nutrient issues in the plant, and I'm going to talk about those a bit. Okay, so managing potassium sort of at that optimum level is really important. So you can see that if you are calculating what your crop is removing, and then you're adding that in on top of what's in the soil, you can create some pretty significant issues for your crops by doing that. There's lots of sources of potassium if you need it. There's manure, of course, which is a great source of potassium, especially liquid manure, which is why we get in a lot of trouble in some of our fields with having too much potassium. Because for those of you that have liquid manure, you've seen that for every 1,000 gallons you put on, there's 20 pounds available to your crop. So it doesn't take long for that to be far more than what your crop needs. If you have clay soils, then all that extra potassium gets bound onto those clays and can get stuck there in the middle, and then you kind of have even a bigger issue because it doesn't leach out as readily in clays. There are lots of potassium fertilizers available, so I would say, in my mind, potassium is one of the easier nutrients to be able to get to your crops if it's deficient, regardless sort of how you choose to farm. Because you can buy, there's all these wood ash products now. There's Sopomag that's certified organic. Split applications of potassium are really important. If your recommendation came back saying you need 300 pounds of potassium, you don't want to put all of that on in one slug because of the fact that plants will just keep sucking it up. You actually want to break that up into multiple applications so that they don't luxury consume. And then, of course, if you have sandy soils, and you put on split applications, it keeps it from leaching. When you actually have the proper pH and you've limed your soil, you have more room for potassium on those binding sites, okay? And that's really important because if you can increase the level of exchangeable potassium, so what gets stuck to your soil, it can help reduce overall leaching. So keeping the soils in the right pH is important for potassium. Managing potassium in your feeds, I think it's really interesting to note that potassium in your feeds is highest in that first cutting, and then after that the levels go down. You have generally a really significant flush of potassium that's released from soils in the spring during the thaw and sort of cycling of water at that point. And so your first cut tends to be the highest in potassium, and then it declines over time. It's interesting because it's opposite of all the other nutrients. And in terms of how potassium impacts the uptake of the other nutrients needs to be noted. And I'm not, an animal person per se. I took a lot of animal nutrition classes, but this is very similar to how it works in your cows as well. So here's the fertilizer applications of potassium, and you can see no potassium, and then increasing levels up to about 300 kilograms of potassium per hectare. And then over here you can see the mineral levels in the feed. So when you're not adding potassium to the soil, you can see the levels of calcium, sodium, and magnesium are quite high. But as you increase the application of potassium, it impacts the amount of the other nutrients that goes into your plants. If your soil test levels are excessive, you are limiting the uptake of calcium, magnesium, sodium, and a few other nutrients into your plants. So if you're on the low side, again, you're sort of depleting yields. If you're too high, then you're minimizing the uptake of other really essential nutrients, which is important, right? Because these are just as important to your crops and to your animals as the potassium. So balancing that potassium in your soil is critical. Okay, another interesting point here is how potassium influences nitrogen uptake and how that impacts yields. So here on this axis is crop yield, and down on the bottom are nitrogen applications, and these bars represent potassium applications. So when you don't apply potassium and you apply high rates of nitrogen, you see a little yield boost, but not much. Versus if you're applying sort of the optimum rate of nitrogen and the optimum rate of potassium, you can see the significant yield increase that you get. The rates here are just sort of relative to essentially show you that one impacts the other. And again, this goes back to if you're giving the crop all of the nitrogen it needs and you're not giving it the potassium that it needs, you will not get the maximum yield, because nitrogen uptake by the plant is closely linked to the potassium. So if the potassium isn't there, the nitrogen isn't carried into the plant. Okay, it's less efficient. right? So again, the take-home message is you really need to pay attention to potassium. You really need to manage it because it does impact so many other things in your crops. And again, just the metabolic disorders that we see that involve potassium, milk fever, and then grass tetany. So you have hypocalcemia, hypomagnesia, right? So milk fever, so not enough calcium, and sometimes not getting enough calcium is linked to too much potassium, okay? Because you just saw how they get taken up into the plant, how they're impacted. Too much potassium minimizes the calcium, and the calcium is important to those freshening animals. So the potassium content of the grass, hay, and silage that has come into the UVM testing lab varied widely. Okay, so we would have really low potassium feeds and extremely high, and really sort of want to be somewhere in here. Right, so they were kind of all over the board. And what influenced that? So if you do have high potassium soils and high potash feeds, is there a way to manage that? Or is there a way to manage it in general? Okay, because of this luxury consumption. So stage of maturity of the crop, time of the year, type of grass, all those things impact how much potassium is in the feed. Stage of maturity, of course, the more mature the grass gets, the less potassium there is, but that's not really helpful because we usually want to be cutting feed that's not that mature. But if you're trying to maybe make some dry cow feed and you need some low potash feed, this is kind of something to look at. We already talked about the time of the year too. You know, I showed you that graph that showed you the high flush of potassium in the spring. Those will likely always be the high potash feeds. And then if the soil test levels are reasonable, the potash in your crop should decline over the second and third cuts. All right. Here's a normal range of potassium for crops. And again, we're kind of looking kind of in this 1 to 2%. You can see how high pasture is, and that's, you know, mostly because we are harvesting those really lush young grasses. Forage species does impact the amount of potassium, and you can see that something like orchard grass usually has high potash in orchard grass. I think we all know that orchard grass loves cow manure. That's why people love to grow it. It can take up a lot of nitrogen, a lot of potassium, and make good yields. And that's a lot of the reason that people grow it in this region. But you can see there are some species that have less potassium in them compared to others. So grass tetany. So you get low blood magnesium levels. Remember, potassium. So uptake of magnesium into the plant is influenced heavily by potassium. So if you have high potassium soils, it will ultimately impact the amount of magnesium that's taken up by that plant. Sometimes even if there's, you know, adequate amounts of magnesium in the soil, it just can get into the plant faster. It's generally something we see in the spring again because we see that flush of potassium that comes out of the soil in the spring. So you get that rapid uptake by the crop. So magnesium concentrations in the forage are reduced by high, you know, levels of K. And again, sometimes you just get that flush in the spring, which can cause a reduced uptake of magnesium, especially if magnesium is low in your soils overall. And then also we can see that in the spring due to low soil oxygen levels, which sometimes is common if the soils are really saturated. To reduce the risk of hypomagnesia, increase the legume content of the pasture, which means those crops will take up a lot of the potash in the first place. Use split applications of potassium and also nitrogen. So most people aren't applying potassium in the spring, but if you're thinking about applying manure or something like that early on, probably shouldn't do it. And then if you're liming, you want to lime with something that's high mag versus low mag. And then you can also supplement with magnesium salt, which will be helpful. That's potassium.